There is no constitutional issue here. It is wrong, deadly wrong, to deny any of your fellow Americans the right to vote in this country.
The year is 1964. Lyndon B. Johnson was president, and the country was still mourning the loss of Kennedy. The median income was $6,600. The average cost of a loaf of bread is 21 cents, and gas prices are just 25 cents a gallon. The Beatles arrived in the U.S. for the first time, and Martin Luther King Jr. won the Nobel Peace Prize. These were just some of the stories making headlines. But there was one tragic story that was splashed across the front pages of newspapers for a brief time that most of us were unaware of. A tragedy that took place inside this home at 1140 Ashmount Avenue in Oakland, California. The murders of Dr. Frank Martin's wife, Betty, and daughter, Carolyn, slipped out of the headlines long ago. So once again, we're going to move the cold case back into the light of day. We're going to explore a case that should have never been forgotten. This cold case takes us to Crocker Highlands, an upscale neighborhood in Oakland, California. The Martins lived here in this sprawling 12-room Spanish-style home. It was an idyllic life until that horrible morning of January 22nd, 1964. This is Dr. Frank Martin. Dr. Martin had a thriving practice in the city and centered much of his life around church and community. He sang in the church choir and was a member of the Oakland Orpheus. This is Mary Elizabeth Martin. Everyone called her Betty, and she is our first victim. If you asked Betty what was the most important thing in her life, she would have told you that her marriage and being the mother of 2 lovely daughters was her greatest joy. But beyond this, 43-year-old Betty had some achievements of her own outside of her family. She was president of the Orpheus Auxiliary, vice president of the San Francisco Presbyterian Society, department chairman of the Women's Association of the First United Presbyterian Church, and denominational chairman of the Oakland Council of United Church Women. This photo shows Betty being honored as Mother of the Year in 1963. This is Carolyn Martin. Carolyn is our second victim. The 18-year-old was pursuing a teaching career at Chico State College. Her classmates remember her as quiet, enthusiastic, and just a delightful person with the loveliest smile that you could ever imagine. Carolyn's boyfriend, Jerome Serco, told police that he drove Carolyn home after they completed their mid-year final exams. They arrived at her home at around 7:15 p.m. Tuesday, January 21st, the day before she was murdered. This was the last time he saw her alive. This is Susan Martin. Susan shared many of the same qualities as Carolyn. In fact, the 2 sisters could have been mistaken for twins. The 16-year-old was a good student and involved in many activities like Carolyn. Unfortunately, it was Susan who first discovered the murders of her mother and sister. Before we go into the timeline, let's discuss an occurrence that took place just 7 months before the murders. On June 29, 1963, someone burglarized the Martin home. The only items taken were a bed jacket and some nylons. It was not disclosed who the items belonged to, but what we do know is that this type of individual usually has some sort of sexual fetish. Research has shown that the stealing of undergarments is exclusively male. While there is no clear pattern of escalation into physical attacks, these types of thefts should never be taken lightly. An 8-year study concluded that these burglars are usually sex offenders, and half of them have molested children, and a quarter of them have raped women. Police investigating these types of burglaries have stated that most victims are not chosen randomly, and oftentimes the victim knows the offender or has had brief contact with them. It's also highly probable that the victim was being watched, and routines were being noted. Under no circumstances should a victim fail to report such a crime. In the case of the Martins, there was one comment made by Reverend Harley Pryor shortly after the murders that I thought was worth noting. Reverend Pryor stated that Betty was intensely interested in people, and that is how she approached life. If this was truly Betty's way of connecting with people, it's possible that she could have innocently showed interest in the wrong person. This individual may have become fixated on her and her family. Although we will be looking into other theories, it's important to note that there's a high probability that the burglar and the murderer are most likely one and the same. Moving on to the timeline, we'll see the police were able to account for every hour leading up to Betty and Carolyn's murders that morning. As we enter into the afternoon hours, police begin to rely more on eyewitness accounts of those in the area of the home to fill in the missing pieces. The morning started with the family having breakfast together. Afterward, Carolyn helped Betty do the dishes, then everyone began their scheduled plans for the day. At 8 a.m., Dr. Martin leaves for work, making a quick stop along the way to drop Susan off at school. At 9 a.m., Betty and Carolyn get ready to take the family dog to the SPCA shelter for a shot. The drive would have taken them about 25 minutes. At 9:45 a.m., shelter attendants say Betty and Carolyn arrived at around 9:30 a.m. and waited a short time before the dog had received its shot. At 9:55 a.m., Betty and Carolyn leave the shelter with the dog. At 10:20 a.m., Betty and Carolyn arrive back home, and police know this because there's no reports of anyone seeing the two women making any stops along the way. Upon entering the home, the two women are immediately attacked. At 10:30 a.m., a postman reports delivering mail to the home, and everything was quiet inside. At 12 p.m., an exterminating company is finishing up a job next door to the Martin home. The men report that they didn't hear or see anything out of the ordinary coming from the Martin home. 3:30 p.m., a neighbor boy takes a shortcut through the Martins' yard and reported that everything was quiet inside the home. 5:30 p.m., Susan is dropped off by her boyfriend after school. She discovers her mother and sister dead in the living room. 5:35 p.m., Susan makes an emergency call for help. 6 p.m., Dr. Martin arrives home and is told by police and Susan what has happened. Fear was now beginning to set in. This was a fashionable, safe neighborhood, a place to raise your children. Doors that were sometimes left carelessly unlocked were now bolted. Dogs were being quickly snatched up from local shelters, and neighbors were suddenly looking at each other suspiciously. There was a psychopath loose, and no one knew who he was or where he would strike next. Oakland Police Captain Alvin King assembled a team of 14 men to investigate the double murders, and they worked around the clock to try to piece together why these two women were targeted and how the killer got away unnoticed. The investigation showed no forced entry and nothing in the home had been taken. The only room disturbed by the killer was the living room, where the bodies of Betty and Carolyn were found, and the dog had not been harmed. It looked as though Carolyn may have entered the home first, followed by Betty after a brief delay. She may have been caring for the dog. From the positioning of items belonging to Betty, it appeared that she may not have been aware that Carolyn had fallen victim to the killer. Betty put her purse and keys on the counter between the kitchen and the living room. She was wearing gloves and had time to remove them before being attacked. We know this because the gloves were found under her body. Beyond what was noticeable by the naked eye, a forensic investigation turned up 150 fingerprints, most of which belonged to the family, while others were unclassified. Fibers, several human hairs, blood, and semen were collected from the scene. Both of the women's purses contained money and remained untouched. As for how the killer was able to slip in and out of the house without being detected by neighbors was by the seclusion of the home itself. It was shaded by tall pine trees and partially hidden by shrubs. Police commented that the home was an intruder's dream. There were large windows opening off a well-hidden porch, and there were many shadowy places to hide. Let's now move on to how Betty and Carolyn were murdered and what injuries they sustained. This is a diagram of the murder scene that was released to the public. We will highlight the areas as we go over as many of the details that we were able to unearth of the scenario laid out by investigators and other sources. The killer was most likely observing the Martin home that morning. He watched Dr. Martin leave with Susan, followed by Betty and Carolyn. He somehow entered the home, perhaps a door or window was left unlocked. While waiting for the women to return, the killer could have been carefully going through their undergarments and other personal items. This behavior is what excites him. Both women were strangled, which indicates a plan to quickly silence them by cutting off not only their screams, but their oxygen. When the two women returned home, Carolyn walked from the garage, through the kitchen, and 2 steps down into the sunken living room. The killer was probably hiding in the corner where the piano was located. Using some nylons he tied together in a simple overhand knot, he quickly came from behind Carolyn and wrapped the stockings around her neck. She falls forward, striking her head on the floor, causing contusions above her left eye, forehead, and area near her mouth. In as little as 3 minutes, Carolyn is now dead. The killer leaves Carolyn on the floor and goes back into hiding. He is waiting for Betty with an electrical cord that he has ripped off the hi-fi set. At first, Betty is unaware of what has happened to her daughter. She may have been distracted by the dog. Betty then calls out to Carolyn, and when she doesn't answer, Betty looks into the living room. She sees her daughter laying motionless on the floor and rushes towards her. Hearing the killer behind her, Betty turns to look at him, and he immediately wraps the cord around her neck and pulls it tight. Betty struggles and falls backward, hitting her head on an end table and smashing an ashtray as the killer continues to pull tighter on the cord. There are contusions and lacerations on the back of Betty's head. She dies, looking into his eyes. The killer rolls Betty over so she is face down and uses what is left of the cord from around her neck to tie her arms behind her back. He now has Betty's blood on his hand. By this time, the postman is delivering the mail at around 10:30 a.m. Fearing that he will be discovered, he leaps for the drapery cord from behind the sofa. As you can see on the diagram, the sofa is sitting at an angle because the killer has pushed it aside as he grabbed for the cord. The drapes are now closed, and he has left a bloody print on the back of the sofa. The killer is now at the height of his frenzy as he returns to Carolyn's lifeless body. He removes her blouse and stretch pants. Her bra is ripped and hanging off to the side by one strap, and her underwear has been thrown aside. This is when he rapes her. The killer then stands to look at his handiwork, and in his twisted mind he feels the need to leave a signature behind. He goes back over to Betty and removes her right shoe. The end of one cord has just enough length to make a small noose to slip over her big toe. He bends her right leg back and secures the noose around the toe. This illustration of the position was placed in the local newspaper. The same hog-tying position is then replicated on Carolyn. What a horrifying scene for Susan Martin to find that day after school. Her mother and sister murdered and degraded. What kind of killer are we dealing with here? A psychopath that takes his time to leave a signature. Was this detail left to taunt police, or was he just living out a sick fantasy? Is he young or older? Did he have some sort of prior contact with Betty or Carolyn? And how was he able to observe them as they moved about their daily routines without drawing attention to himself? Was he from the neighborhood, or perhaps a delivery man that no one ever gave a second thought to? More importantly, did he go on to commit other murders? Over the decades, everyone has formed their own opinion about who the killer may be. Some believe that this was the beginning of the Zodiac's killing spree. Others believe it was a killer newsmen were calling the East Bay Strangler. Investigators came from as far away as Massachusetts when they were hunting for Albert DeSalvo, the Boston Strangler. The 60s were a tumultuous time that gripped a nation in fear over the violent murders of so many. It seemed as if law enforcement was scrambling just to keep up and trying their best to get these cases solved. At the time of the Martin murders, there were two cases that had similar MOs that police were focusing their attention on. We're going to do a side-by-side comparison to see if we think police were on the right track and see if we can find some common threads. We'll put a map up on the right side of your screen so you can see just how close these murders were to one another. Our first victim is Marion Skiter, murdered February 10, 1962 in San Leandro. Age 43, brunette and wore glasses, married with children. Killer made a series of incoherent phone calls to her several weeks before her murder. Her body was found tied to a beam in a church. Strangled with an electrical cord and feet were bound. Left shoe was off and found 50 feet from her body. Beaten and throat was slashed. Some clothing removed, and there was no confirmation if she had been sexually assaulted. Police believe her killer was stalking her and was very familiar with the area. After he snatched her from a supermarket parking lot at around 8 p.m., he took her to a church where he was familiar with the hours and how to gain entry. This is a photo of the church, along with a photo of the cord used to bind her. Our next victim is Jane Stableton, murdered 5 days after the Martins on January 27, 1964, in San Pablo. Age 40, brunette, married with children, extremely religious. It's unknown if there were any odd occurrences or contact with a killer before her murder. She was murdered sometime after 1:30 a.m. after returning from a church service in Oakland. Jane was found on her dining room floor by her son at 3 a.m. Killer may have gained entry through a window that had been broken for quite some time. Her skull was fractured, contusions on her scalp, face, nose, mouth, abrasions on shoulders, elbows, and knees. She was strangled with an electrical cord and suffocated with a plastic bag. Her nightgown was in disarray, and there was no confirmation if she had been sexually assaulted. Jane's husband was a police officer on duty at the time, and her son was in a band performing when the murder occurred. Neighbors stated that they didn't hear any sounds coming from the Stableton home in those early morning hours. As you can see, there are many similarities in all three cases. There is the age of the victims to consider, except for Carolyn, that seems to be the only anomaly. All 4 women had dark hair. There were conflicting reports on whether Marion and Jane were assaulted, so we can't confirm that. There is some sort of religious pattern also showing up. And of course, all 4 were strangled. Police were looking for a link between the victims, but no evidence of that ever materialized. Before the Martin case went cold, police were also looking at a few other angles that were all dead ends. So let's take a final look at those. Number 1, several sex offenders in the area were brought in and questioned, and only one stood out. The suspect had a record of grand larceny, petty theft, and burglary. He was on probation at the time, but police were unsuccessful at linking him to the crimes. Number 2, the 3 exterminators working next door to the Martin home all denied seeing anything out of the ordinary that day. Police were skeptical about this, but quickly moved on to other leads at the time. Number 3, there was a UC Berkeley student that some accused of being obsessed with Carolyn. Police were so suspicious of his behavior, they sent an undercover officer in to pose as a student. The officer tried to get the young man to divulge something incriminating, but they walked away empty-handed. So where do we go from here? It's sad to think that over time these cases go by the wayside. They get relegated to the back of the line to collect dust. It's true that each of these cases contain boxes of evidence, but beyond the fibers, fingerprints, cords, and DNA, these boxes also contain what is left of a life that has been violently and needlessly taken. There is a voice that has been silenced. For every dust-covered box of evidence, there is someone out there that knows something. If you have any information about any of these crimes, please be that voice for Betty, Carolyn, Marion, and Jane. Please reach out to a member of law enforcement and help get these cases solved. Are you obsessed with true crime content? Subscribe now and join our growing community as we analyze and discuss the details of some truly baffling cold cases. Browse our growing library of cold case investigations and immerse yourself in the mysteries that keep us up at night. Subscribe and join the EOJ community today. All it takes is a click.